Have you ever wondered what that number on your camera lens means? Well, buckle up because we're about to dive into the fascinating world of focal lengths. When you peer through your camera lens, the magic you see is brought to life by the lens's focal length. Technically speaking, the focal length is the distance from the lens to the point where the light rays passing through the lens focus onto the focal plane. It's the journey the light takes from the moment it enters your lens to the point it hits your camera's sensor, or if you're old school, the film. This distance is measured in millimeters, which is what those numbers on your lens are all about. Now you might be thinking, great, but what does this mean for my photos? Well, the focal length is a big player in the game of magnification. You see, the longer the focal length, the more the lens magnifies the scene. Picture this. You're shooting with a 50mm lens and you switch to a 200mm lens without moving your feet. Suddenly, your subject that was a small part of your frame now fills the entire frame. That's magnification at work, all thanks to the magic of focal length. So, when you're out and about, camera in hand, and you're adjusting that number on your lens, remember this, you're not just twiddling a dial. You're manipulating the very fabric of your scene's magnification. You're pulling your subject closer or pushing the world further away, all with the subtle twist of your lens. But keep in mind, the focal length doesn't just impact the magnification. It plays a role in the perspective and compression of your scene too. But that's a story for another scene. So, when you adjust the M on your lens, you're essentially changing the magnification of your scene. And with that, you've taken the first step into the vast universe of focal lengths. Let's keep exploring, shall we? Now that we understand what focal length is, let's explore how it affects the perspective and compression of a scene. When you adjust the focal length of your lens, you're not just zooming in or out. You're changing the whole sense of depth and scale within your image. The focal length isn't what directly alters the perspective, though. It's actually the change in camera position that's required to keep a foreground subject the same size when you switch between focal lengths. Imagine you've got a table full of objects in front of you. If you're shooting with a wide-angle lens, you'll be up close and personal with those objects. The ones in the background will appear pretty small. Now, if you switch to a telephoto lens, you'll need to step back quite a bit to keep the foreground objects the same size in your frame. This change in position alters the angle of view, making the distance between the foreground and background objects appear compressed. This concept is known as compression. It's a bit like looking down a long hallway. The further away you are, the shorter the hallway appears. That's because the distance between the far end of the hallway and the nearer sections seems to shrink. The same thing happens in your photographs when you use a longer focal length. It's important to remember that while the compression effect can be visually interesting, it can also distort the spatial relationship between objects. So while a longer focal length can make a mountain seem closer to a hiker in the foreground, it can also make a person's nose appear larger than it really is in a close-up shot. This is why understanding focal length and its effects on perspective and compression is so important. It's not just about how much of the scene you can fit into your frame, it's also about how the elements within that scene relate to each other. So the next time you're out shooting, try experimenting with different focal lengths. Notice how the changing perspective and compression can dramatically alter the mood and feel of your images. This means that the focal length can dramatically change the way your image looks, even if your foreground subject remains the same size. So how does focal length apply to both film and digital photography? You might wonder. Well, let's dive right in. In the world of 35mm film photography, there are some well-known standards when it comes to focal lengths. A 43mm lens, for instance, is used to approximate the standard field of view on a 35mm camera, yet interestingly enough, a 50mm is typically considered the standard focal length. Despite being slightly narrower than the human perspective, a 50mm lens retains the spatial relationship between objects in the image, closely mirroring the way we perceive the world. On the other hand, a 20mm lens offers a wide-angle perspective, while a 500mm lens provides significant magnification. Now, when we shift our focus to digital photography, the concept of focal length gets a bit more complex due to the variation in sensor sizes. Most digital cameras have sensors that are smaller than a single frame of 35mm film. This means that the lens's focal length can be much shorter, yet still produce the same angle of view one would expect from a lens designed for a 35mm film camera. Because of these differences in sensor sizes, and since the focal length measurements used in 35mm film photography are recognized standards, we often use what we call 35mm focal length equivalents to provide a common reference point for digital cameras. For instance, consider the Canon PowerShot G11 digital camera. This camera has a lens that can zoom from 6.1 mm to 30.5 mm. Although this is the actual focal length measurement, it might not mean much until we translate it into a 35mm equivalent. This helps us understand the field of view we can expect from this lens in terms we're more familiar with. Understanding this can help you better choose your lens and camera settings for the desired effect in your photos. So next time you're out capturing the world, remember, the power of perspective is just a lens switch away. Let's quickly run over the main points about focal length. Focal length, in layman's term, can be thought of as the level of magnification a lens provides. Measured in millimeters, the greater the focal length, the more the lens magnifies the scene. It's this distance from the lens to the focal plane where light rays converge. Now, focal length doesn't just dictate magnification, it also impacts the perspective and compression of an image. A change in camera position, necessitated by a change in focal length, can significantly alter your image's perspective and make the distance between objects appear compressed. Transitioning from film to digital, the focal length required for a similar magnification varies due to different sensor sizes. For instance, digital cameras often have smaller sensors than a 35mm film frame, meaning they can use a much shorter focal length and still achieve the same angle of view. And there you have it. That's your crash course on focal length. Remember, understanding your equipment is the first step to capturing your perfect shot.